There are so many shafts out there to pick from. Different brands, different models, different colors, different prices, different weights, different torques, different bend profiles. How are you supposed to pick the right one? How are you supposed to know that you've got the right shaft for your game? We're going to talk about all those specs and help you figure out how to get the right shaft. So let's go. Hi everyone, welcome to the Mobile Club Maker. I'm AJ. I hope you're having a wonderful day. So we are going to cover in this video all the different specs when you're looking at golf shafts. And beyond just talking about, well, what do each of these specs mean, I'm going to sort of lay out how I think they fall in order of importance. So we're going to kind of rank them, or at least group them into three different categories based on how important, how influential those items, those specs are going to be for your game. Okay, so the first attribute, the first spec that we're going to be talking about are the actual dimensions of the shaft. Now, obviously, if you're going to a fitting or something like that, they're already going to have the shafts picked out. They're going to know the right shafts for the particular head that you're using. But if you're buying shafts on your own, you just want to be aware of a couple things. So if we're talking about iron shafts, we're going to have two main sizes. You're either going to have 370 or parallel tip or 355 which is taper tip. Two different tip sizes, ideally going into two different hosel sizes that match up. Now the thing about iron shafts is, as far as going into iron heads, is they can kind of dance with each other. So if you have a 370 hosel, you can put a 355 tip shaft in it. You just need a little brass shim. Likewise, if you have a 370 shaft, you can put it into a 355 hosel. However, it's going to take a little extra effort. If we're talking about a steel shaft, then really your only option is to get a tool called a reamer and basically sort of remove some of the material from inside the hosel, widening the hosel out, going from 355 to 370. The other option, if you're using a graphite shaft, is you can actually just sort of sand down the tip of that shaft, taking it from 370 down to 355 so it will fit into that hosel. Now, all that being said, when you're picking out shafts, ideally, if you can find the shaft that's the right size for that hosel without having to make any adjustments, shim anything, grind anything, sand anything, it's going to make your life a lot easier to just get the right shaft right out of the gate. But if you can't, you can obviously switch them around. When it comes to woods, you're going to have two options again, but these are going to be a little different. 335. 335 is the standard now for wood shafts. Basically, any wood you buy within the last 5 years, they're all 335. You go back further than that, you will also run into the size 350. Now, if you have a 335 shaft, once again, kind of like putting that smaller iron shaft into the bigger hosel in your irons, you can do the same thing with the woods. A 335 shaft will go into a 350 hosel. You just need a brass shim. However, if you have a 350 shaft, there is no way to take that 350 shaft and put it into a 335 wood hosel. So be aware of that. Okay, so the next spec we're going to be talking about is weight. Now, we're going to be talking about weight, and I'm combining that with balance. Now, weight being just the static weight of the golf shaft. And golf shafts can range anywhere from in the 30-gram range in graphites all the way up to 130 something grams in steel shafts. And the basic idea with weight is the lighter the shaft is, the easier it is to swing. The heavier the shaft is, the more control you get. So at that point, it becomes a balancing act between, being able to swing the club easily and be able to swing it quickly, but at the same time have control. So that's kind of the trade-off. That's what you're trying to pit against each other is you want both some control, but you also want some distance, be able to swing it easily. So that's what you're looking for. On top of that, I would say, and I always say this in my videos when I'm building clubs, is it's good to have a good steady progression in weight through the set. So you don't want to have, 75-gram shafts in your irons and an 85-gram shaft in your driver, ideally. That just doesn't usually make sense for most golfers. Ideally, you want your heaviest shafts in your wedges and your irons and getting progressively lighter as you move through the set into your woods, and your driver ideally being the lightest club. The other part of weight is balance or balance point. You will sometimes hear people talking about counterbalance shafts. And what that is basically referring to is just shafts that more of the weight is focused on the butt end of them. Why would you pick a counterbalance shaft? Well, one of two main reasons. Either one, you are wanting to make the clubs longer, in which case a standard shaft with a longer club will give you a heavier and heavier swing weight. A counterbalance shaft or a more butt-weighted shaft will sort of negate some of that and make the swing weight more normalized, let's say. The other option is if you wanted to play with heavier headed clubs, you wanted more weight in the driver head, something like that. Again, this would allow you to do that without getting into higher, maybe unwieldy swing weights. So while still keeping the actual total weight of the shaft the same. So that's why you see counterbalance shafts. Important to know that though, because if you're going to a fitting or you're trying out shafts, you want to be aware of what kind of balance point the shaft has. Is it a neutral balance point? Is more of the weight focused in the butt end so that it changes the head feel and the club feels lighter? Because that's going to be a pretty major difference when you're swinging golf clubs. So just like with weight, just like with total weight, where you can feel the difference between a 60-gram shaft and an 80-gram shaft, or a 60-gram shaft and a 70-gram shaft, you will very easily be able to tell the difference in most cases between a shaft that's counterbalanced versus a shaft that is more tip heavy, assuming you have the same head. And that can have a drastically different impact on how you swing the club, how your swing sequence is. So definitely something to be aware of, because that will make a big impact. Okay, so the last spec in this first category would be the flex. Some people are going to like a very stiff shaft. Some people are going to like a softer shaft. Some people will like a very soft shaft. It's going to really come down to personal preference, what you like the feel of, what's in the rest of your clubs, and what lines up as far as continuity goes. But what just feels right for your swing, what allows you to make the most consistent swing, gives you the most consistent results. That's really what flex is important for. Okay, so while that first category, that first group is big, obvious, if you have any experience with golf, you'll be able to tell the difference when you change something in one of those specs. The second category, we're talking about much smaller, much more nuanced changes. Heck, a lot of golfers probably wouldn't even notice the difference if you change some of these specs around. So these are going to be more sort of fine-tuning, but not as important, not as obvious as the first ones we talked about as far as weight, balance, flex, obviously the right dimensions. First is going to be bend profile, or basically how the shaft bends along its entire length. It can sometimes be referred to, or it used to be referred to, as kick point, bend point, things like that. Now you'll see EI curves, which are line graphs, or you'll just see numbers designating the stiffness of the butt versus the mid section versus the tip section. All of them basically telling you how the shaft flexes, and in general giving you some idea that this shaft may launch the ball slightly higher or slightly lower. Now that being said, in general, these are all going to be very small changes, okay? If you need to actually change the loft, the trajectory on your driver, what I would be looking at is changing the loft, or changing your impact position on the face, or changing the driver head altogether. Those are going to have a bigger impact than trying to sort of tweak it based on the shaft. You may see a little difference, but in a lot of cases you may not see any difference, at least over the long term. The next one we're going to talk about is torque, or torsional stiffness. Torque used to be a big advertising selling point on shafts back 15 years ago or so. They would have the torque written right on the shaft in the identification, in the model number basically. You'd have the, whatever shaft 2.5 or the something shaft 3.5, really highlighting that torque. Modern shafts in the last few years, they've really gone away from highlighting torque. And I think it's because in general, it just doesn't have that big an impact other than on the feel. And a lot of that at this point, really, the feel can be dictated by different materials that they're used. So it really has less of an impact, or less of a perceived impact now than it used to. So what I would tell you is, if you're looking for a certain torque, probably not even worth bothering with. I would get all the other specs figured out first. Get the weight, get the flex, get the bend profile, make sure it's the right diameter, length, all those things for you. And whatever you come up with after you've gotten all those things dialed in, whatever the torque is that the manufacturer has built into that shaft, that's what you go with. Don't worry about it. You don't need to go out searching for a shaft that has torque numbers between 3.2 and 3.7. Get the other stuff dialed in and let the torque fall where it does. Okay, last group. This is sort of what's left over at the end. And the first is going to be price. Obviously, price has no direct influence on how the shaft performs, but it is going to be a pretty influential factor for a lot of people on picking a shaft. All I can say is when it comes to price, don't believe that just because a shaft is more expensive, it's better. And more importantly, don't believe that just because a shaft is more expensive, it's going to be better specifically for you. Make sure you get the specs right, you have the weight, you have the flex, you have all the things we've talked about, and then you can decide whether you want to spend X dollars or 4X dollars on a shaft. In some cases, maybe you'll see a difference. I would argue for a lot of golfers, if the specs are similar, it won't matter if that shaft cost you $50 or it cost $450. The end result is probably going to be the same. The last spec, and it's not actually a spec, but we're just going to say the appearance of the shaft. Graphite shafts at this point have gotten very obvious, very loud looking. It seems like the heads of the clubs have gotten much more subdued. They're all basically, you know, some shade of gray or going into black. And the shafts have now become very obvious, very loud, very bright. And I would just say, just something to be aware of. Make sure when you're picking out shafts that you're not just looking at all the specs and not looking at the appearance, because, you know, at the end of the day, you are going to notice the paint job on it. And if it is something loud, if it is something obnoxious that bothers you, it's probably not a good thing, and it's probably not going to help your results. So when I'm looking for shafts, or when I'm helping people look for shafts, this is the order that I go through when I'm picking out shafts. You know, first making sure I know the right size, the right diameters that we're working with, and then picking out the right weight, picking out the right balance for it, then picking out the flex, then picking out the bend profile, letting the torque fall where it does, and then finally, what's the price, what's the appearance look like, making sure those are not obnoxious or offensive to the person that you're doing this for. That is, I think, in most cases going to be what gives people their best results, because it really sort of focuses in as you go down. You want to make sure that you have those big things right. You want to make sure those are right first. And after that, everything else is sort of fine-tuning, dialing it in. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go down below, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please think about subscribing to the channel and hit that little bell icon down below so you can see when I release new videos. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. I read and answer all of those. Also, I am on Instagram. You can find me at Mobile Club Maker. Until next time, go play some golf. We will see you on the next video. Bye.